Oh, and good evening. It's February 13th, 2025, and welcome to another one of our branches in the vine with an episode from the folks at Aleph Beta. I enjoy the connections across Scripture and the need for those connections, and of course, here at the Dusty Feet, we sometimes refer to those connections as echoes. Connected thinking. One, where have you heard that before? And two, then how might they be related? How do they relate? Rabbi David Fohrman has another engaging series of videos on biblical echoes, but it's on the book of the Maccabees. So welcome this evening to another thought-provoking journey from Aleph Beta with biblical echoes. The book of the Maccabees on the Dusty Feet. And of course, before we forget, if we find these kinds of podcasts useful, then click the subscribe button. The reminders, they just help you. But also, you think these might be useful to others, that's when you click that like button, because that's how YouTube will choose to share these to more people if they wish. So we know this is a 4-part series. I hope it's going to be an engaging journey as we read about and listen to these echoes. Many are unfamiliar with the book of the Maccabees. I suspect most are going to hear about this for the very first time. But I'm compelled and I believe that it's a journey worth taking. If you choose to make it to part 4, there's a connection that I suspect I don't think you're ready for. Oppression, tax collectors, deceit, slavery, storehouses, Moses, Saul, echo to the Messiah. At a minimum, an introduction to where we are in this part of the story. But the events in the first book of the Maccabees occurs between the last prophet, Micah, right, and the Gospels, where they pick up at the story of Messiah. So we have approximately a 400-year gap. A lot can happen in there. This is part 3. So we're going to continue our journey. Listen to this video, open your minds, and see if you recognize the connections the rabbi mentions. Would you see them too? Enjoy the video.
So in our last video, we saw all these resonances of the Egypt story, servitude and redemption, in the story that the author of the book of Maccabees tells about the oppression of Antiochus and the rise of Matityahu, leader of the Maccabees, against him. When Matityahu dies, though, those parallels to the Egypt story seem to end. At least I can't find any more. But just as the torch is being passed to a new generation, and Yehuda HaMaccabee, the son of Matityahu, takes over leadership of this band of fighters, you will hear echoes of an entirely different biblical story besides the Exodus. And let me show you what I mean. The book of Maccabees in chapter 2 picks up on the narrative after the death of Matityahu. It chronicles the first battle, really, between Yehuda, the new leader, and the Greek-Syrian troops. So there's this Greek general by the name of Saron. He's advancing, and Yehuda comes out to meet him in battle with a comparatively small force of men. Those soldiers look up. They see the staggering array of forces that are gathering against them. And they say to Yehuda HaMaccabee, "How can we, few as we are, fight such a strong a host as this? Besides, we are weak, since we haven't eaten today." But Yehuda said, "Many are easily hemmed in by a few. In the sight of heaven, there is no difference between deliverance by many or by few." Now, if you're just reading this as an account of what happened, it just seems a little strange. I mean, fine, the people are outnumbered, but why that mention that we're really hungry? Can't we have some breakfast? And like Yehuda doesn't even answer, "Sure, help yourself to the Maccabee buffet, just put it on my tab, I'll be happy to pay for it." It doesn't even get picked up on the fact that the people were very hungry and said they hadn't eaten today. But the truth is, I think the reason why it's there, the reason why we're hearing about it, is because each of these things that we are told now is intended to remind us of one biblical story. It's like the author of Maccabees is hitting you over the head, saying, you remember what story we're talking about? Remember when everyone was outnumbered? Remember when the leader said, yeah, don't worry about being outnumbered because God can help you whether you're few or many? Remember when the people didn't have anything to eat? Remember all of that? That's what seems to be happening. What story are we hearing the echoes of that the author of Maccabees wants us to remember? It's the story of Jonathan and King Saul. The story of Jonathan and Saul in their very first war against the Philistines is recounted in the biblical book of Samuel, and it is eerily similar to the events that will occur centuries later in the time of the Maccabees. Israel is occupied by an enemy force, but this time it's not the Syrian Greeks, it's the Philistines. There's a new and untested leader, but this time it's not Matityahu or his son Yehuda, it's Saul and his son Jonathan. The new leader and his son start a war by assassinating a local enemy official, but this time it's not Matityahu assassinating the Syrian Greek official who's forcing him to make a pagan sacrifice, it's Jonathan who assassinates the local Philistine procurator. In both cases, a war ensues, a war in which Israelite forces are vastly outnumbered, but against all odds, they achieve victory anyway. And then there's the language that all of this is couched in. Just before attacking the superior enemy force, Jonathan, son of King Saul, speaks to his armor-bearer, and when he does so, he says the exact words attributed to Yehuda HaMaccabee by the book of the Maccabees. Ein laHashem atzor lo shia barav o b'ma'at. There's nothing that holds back God from saving, whether with many or with few. The book of the Maccabees seems to quote Jonathan's words, placing them in the mouth of Yehuda HaMaccabee centuries later. And, lest you think that maybe all of this is some strange mere coincidence, you have to reckon with a second coincidence too. Remember that piece in the book of the Maccabees about everybody in the outnumbered army being starving, hungry, haven't eaten all day? So it is in the Jonathan and Saul story too. Saul's men are hungry. They haven't eaten all day. For some reason, for better or for worse, Saul instructs them to avoid eating until they've completely vanquished the enemy. So all in all, it really seems pretty clear that the author of the book of the Maccabees is going out of his way to remind his reader of the Saul and Jonathan war that occurred centuries before this. But why would he be doing that? What, if anything, does the author of Maccabees want his reader to understand? I want to suggest to you that if we read the story of Saul and Jonathan carefully, we will find ourselves looking at a gripping and slightly dark tale. The story is actually far more complex and interesting than it seems at first glance. You're going to find that we are not meant to kind of just clap our hands and cheer with pride for the victorious Israelites in that battle. You, the reader, are actually meant to learn some hard but crucial truths in that story that the book of Samuel is telling you. I believe that the author of the book of Maccabees understood the Saul and Jonathan story and wanted us to remember the great truths that emerge from that story, even as we read the story of the Maccabees. It's as if the author of the book of Maccabees had two great covert goals in writing the first few chapters of his book. He wanted the reader to remember about Egypt, and he wanted the reader to remember about Saul and Jonathan. So let's get started here. One of the most difficult parts of the Jonathan and Saul story that jumps out at you as you read it is the role played by the prophet Samuel. You see, Samuel was the prophet who had anointed Saul as the very first king of Israel. And when he did so, he had told Saul something mysterious. He said, "Wait for 7 days for me, and then you and me together, we will offer peace offerings." Now, when he had said that all the way back at Saul's coronation, it seemed unclear exactly what he meant. When was this going to happen, this 7-day wait? He seemed to be saying that at some point in the future there will come a time when you're going to need to wait for 7 days to see me, and then together we'll offer peace offerings. But when exactly would that happen? But then, if you keep on reading the book of Samuel, just a couple chapters later, you find out when that moment was. It actually occurs 2 years later, in the context of the war that we've been talking about, the war that Jonathan and Saul will wage against the Philistines. In that war, Saul finds himself to be completely outnumbered. The Philistines are arraying a vast army to fight him. And to give you a sense of exactly just how outnumbered Saul is, the Israelites start the campaign with 3,000 men. The Philistines have 30,000 chariots. Now, chariots, those are like the ancient equivalent of tanks, so 10 enemy tanks for every Israelite soldier. But in addition to that, the Philistines also have 6,000 trained archers and what the text describes as an innumerable amount of infantry troops, so this is not really a fair fight. Anyway, Saul has gathered his army, and then he starts to do exactly what the prophet had told him he would do. Wait for him for 7 days. This seems to be the appointed moment that Samuel was talking about. Somehow, Saul just knows this is what he meant. I need to wait 7 days for him. So he waits, and as he does so, his men begin to tremble, looking at the vast enemy army gathering against them over on the other hill. They begin to hide in caves and crevices and holes in the ground, but still Saul faithfully waits for Samuel. Day after day he waits, and finally, the appointed 7th day arrives. And Saul's men have now started to abandon him. Out of the 3,000 men he started with, only 600 remain. Saul looks around, and still Samuel has not arrived. So he commands his men to begin to prepare the offerings. He offers the first one, and then, just then, who should he see coming around the bend but the prophet Samuel? Now you can imagine at this point what must have been going through Saul's mind. It's like, how come this took so long, but boy am I glad to see you. So Saul goes out to greet him and to bless him. Vayetze Shaul likrato levarcho. But Samuel's response is absolutely mind-boggling. Vayomer Shmuel me asita. Samuel says, what have you done? Why'd you offer this offering without me? You were supposed to wait. Saul says, the people, they were starting to abandon me. I didn't want to face the enemy in war without offering these offerings to God. Vayomer Shmuel el Shaul. So Samuel says to Saul, Niskalta, you've acted foolishly. Lo shamarta et mitzvat Hashem Elokecha. You have not faithfully kept the command of God. Had you only done so, ki ata heichin Hashem et mamlachta el Yisrael ad olam, God would have prepared your kingship as a dynasty to last forever. Ata mamlachtcha lo takum. Now your dynasty shall not last. Bikesh Hashem lo ish kilvavo, vayitzaveu Hashem lenagid alamo. God will find someone else to be the leader over his people. Now you read this story and your heart just goes out to Saul. I mean, what could Samuel mean by all of this? It just sounds so mean and capricious for him to say this. And anyway, why did Samuel have to wait until the very last minute to arrive? You think that was fun for Saul? Saul's men really were starting to abandon him. The text says so. What did Samuel expect to happen? And even if Saul somehow did transgress here, how bad really was that sin, if we can even call it a sin? Saul's failure seems completely understandable, really. Why does he deserve to lose his entire dynasty because of this apparently trivial misdeed? Nothing about this seems to make any sense. When we come back in our final video in this series, I want to explore this question with you. I believe that the author of the book of Maccabees knew the stories he was quoting very well. He understood the story of Saul, Jonathan, and Samuel. He knew the dark aspects of this story, as well as the happy celebratory ones. There was a reason he wanted his readers to remember the story of Saul when they read about the exploits of Yehuda HaMaccabee. I think he saw a potential danger in the Maccabee victory, as well as a reason to celebrate. There was no better way to bring that danger home to his readers than by evoking Saul and Jonathan's war. Come with me into the next video and let's explore that danger together.
So one of the things that I like about stories, right? One of the things that we enjoy here on the Dusty Feet, right? It's their connectedness, right? The fact that these stories, they're very connected. They're not just intertwined. They actually link to each other. In these families, what we're going on in this particular part, the rulers, and how the story is going to continue, it's going to play out later. It's related to the people that we're actually going to meet in the Messiah's time. Because we'll get there eventually. I just wanted us to remind us and in these stories, and just like the author's intention, because it's to share the connectedness of all of these stories. Because the author of the book of the Maccabees isn't going to go forward in time. They can't do that. They're going to go backward to connect. Hence, it's up to us to see as we hear stories later on, and we're being lived in the direction that they're heading for us, we do the same. We stop. We look back. We see those connections. Maybe we tell the stories. Because I think that's what we see all throughout Scripture. Something's presented, and then we look back, see where it connects. We see this throughout everything, right? We see this as it continues, even through the prophets, right? They're seeing them, they're warning them, they're looking back, they're connecting and warning them of what can happen. But that's how we can, and I say at times possibly, because sometimes we tend to not see these connections, because we can. Maybe we just don't listen to them. But we have an opportunity to look back. And as a rabbi often says, right, he asks, where have you heard this story before? Where have I heard an echo of an element of this in another story? Because sometimes it's not a direct overlay, right? Looking back is enlightening because I think the elements are there and they're still there. Because the rabbi, he helped me understand something. And it was how to look at them in different ways. Because I think the stories have the same elements, right? But they'll be flipped. I mean, instead of a positive side, there'll be a negative side. So we're going to see the same element that's there, like belief, unbelief, faithfulness, unfaithfulness, obeying, not obeying. Because I want us to improve our awareness, to realize the importance of listening to the entirety of a story. And I mean it sometimes like this. We like to take clips, we take verses, we take snips of something. And that's the something that we latch onto. And I think at times that's a detriment to the story because it impedes our ability to listen, to hear, to see other connections. Because I get this comment a lot. It says, oh, I didn't remember that part of the story. I remember that was maybe part of some other story. But now that I understand it, it makes a little more sense. Because sometimes we're so used to somebody just whipping a little snip of a story, I think we miss things that are part of the entire story. And what connects what to what. Okay, so not to make too much of a left turn, but I think it's worth a look, right? Let's use Noah as an example in his story, right? The animals coming on the ark. So go back, read the story, and then tell me how many animals there were and what their notations were as they were brought onto the ark. Because I think there's a good chance that you've missed something. Well, because maybe there's, let's say, more than two of those. I think it just causes us to say that maybe we need to go back, refamiliarize ourselves with these stories, right? We need to do that so then we have a chance to see or hear echoes, right? See the connections to other stories in this master tapestry that God is creating on the biblical scrolls as it rolls on. What do we see? I love seeing connection. I love seeing slightly different connections. And then maybe I ask the question, why? Right? Because I get it. I think we should. Because sometimes it's found in just one little element. In the Saul story, in its parts, right? There's a messenger that tells the people they must do what God's told them. We don't see that in the Maccabees story. Sometimes we talk about faith, belief, something that's substantial to us, right? I think Yehuda Maccabee is aware of the story of Saul, everything that unfolded, and he believes that God is with him in this story, and he goes into battle with this belief, this faith, this understanding. I think it shows where his heart is. Because I think these authors, they have a fantastic way of getting us into this part of the story. They're tying us up. They want us to ask why he thinks they can do that. Because, just like the other one, it's not a wise military choice. But in his mind, in his faith, in his heart, he's embracing that story of Saul. There's a phrase that the rabbi used about the authors of this scroll, the Maccabees, and it was intended for you to remember. I like the phrase. I think it's interesting that telling the story was that intentional, that the author is actually asking us to remember without asking. Another side note. When our lives are looked at in the rearview mirror and another storyteller is telling our story, would it remind folks of these interactions with God? Would it remind other people of these, the ones we're reading in Scripture, with those connections with God? Because I think it's not just the way the storyteller told it. There were elements in the story that did connect. There are other scrolls, like the scroll of the Maccabees, they tell the story of this entire community of people who follow this God, our God, Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh. Yeah? I think it's just something to consider. It's just something to ponder. Because I think we see this in this tapestry of the entire set of scrolls. I mean, do we think we're part of the story? Do we think we're part of this tapestry? Are we part of the scroll? Or do we think we're just some detached new adventure in new scrolls? I think that's a sobering thought. I do. Back to the Maccabees. We get to the part where we're looking at the story with Saul, and then the rabbi brings up the question, how bad was that sin of Saul's? It's an excellent question. How bad was it? I think there's a point that we see here with Saul that maybe there's also an echo that takes us back to another story, to other leaders, and those leaders' expectations of God's direction, and then the direction that they chose to take. I think that we see at times our actions when we're looking at these leaders, as we're looking at them, and it's going to cause a response from God that maybe we don't on the surface at first glance understand, right? We have Moses, a leader, obviously appointed by God. He actually talks to God. But at a point, later on in his history, he gets angry. He gets frustrated with the people. He's been stepping in between them and God multiple times for decades. He loses it. He crosses a line. And I mean by crossing a line, he hits a rock with his staff instead of talking to it. But consequently, Moses, God says, you're not leading them into that land. And you won't even get to go in it. Saul, anointed to be king, had the potential to have multiple dynasties come from him. But he again seems to have something that doesn't seem significant that he does. But God's reaction, there will be no lineage from you. Being a leader, chosen by God for something, I think it's scary. I think it's sobering. And if we look at the stories in Scripture, I think it would cause us to stop and say, am I sure that I'm that guy or am I that gal, right? Because this is not something you can declare for yourself, right? We get the story of Korah just to remind us of what can happen. And wow, what can happen. But in these linked stories, right, we see not only connected to the story, and the storyteller showing these connections, but I think there's something underneath. Because I think there's that expectation of God's leaders and then them actually listening to what God says. But even inside of that, they, and I'll put a parenthesis, maybe say us, need to be an example. We need to be the one saying, hey, you're looking at me as the leader. Am I the example? Not just telling you what to do, but being it, right? Doing it, living it. I think if we really did embrace that, I think it would cause us to walk with humility, fear, trembling. And I think it's worth pondering and discussing amongst yourselves. Because the rabbi, he also seems intrigued. He's looking into this. And as we continue in our series with the biblical echo of the book of the Maccabees, we're going to see where it leads us. Stick with us. Because as we get to our final episode, the next one, I think you'll see a connection that you might find probably pretty eye-opening. So thanks for joining us tonight for another edition of Branches on the Vine with those wonderful folks at Aleph Beta on the Dusty Feet.